Hello everyone, Argsy here. Quick little note before we start the video. I realise we're well into August and this is the video summarising Farming Simulator 25 information from July. A little bit late and a little bit later than I wanted it to, but I did still want to do this so that I have a video summarising every month up until release. Obviously won't cover any of the information that's come out in August. Obviously we've got the Riverbend Springs blog and the Spinach blog which we've heard about in the last few weeks. So this is purely July. Hopefully I've picked everything up. If there's anything I missed, please do drop a comment down below. I would very much appreciate it. So let's roll the video. Let's find out what we learned about Farming Simulator 25 in the month of July. Hello everyone, Argsy here. We are at the end of July and it has been another bumper month for information regarding Farming Simulator 25. Obviously the big source of information this month was from Farmcon, and of course we were there and managed to catch a lot of the presentations and a lot of the information for ourselves and hear about it. So very excited to go through what we heard, what we learned from Farmcon, and any other little tidbits of information that might have come through from other sources. There hasn't really been anything too much, except for the one big announcement from Giant Software that they are partnering with Straight 4 on a new racing simulator game. What that means for Farming Simulator, we don't know yet, but it is an interesting concept, an interesting topic, so we'll discuss that a little bit later on. So let's dive in, summarise everything we know about Farming Simulator 25 for the month of July. So first up, we are going to take a look at the changes that are coming to the game engine. Now, Stefan Geiger, the Chief Technology Officer for Giants, did go through and do a presentation on that, and we're going to take a look at some of the key aspects of that. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about what was said, but really just cover off those main points and summarise exactly what we have learnt. So before we dive into what we learnt at FarmCon, let's just quickly summarise what we already know about Farming Simulator 25. Now, the all-important release date is the 12th of November 2024, so not too many months to go until the game will be available. It is releasing on PC, Mac, PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and S. It won't be available at all on PlayStation 4 or Xbox One, so I'm sorry if you're on an older console, you may just have to look at upgrading. You can currently pre-order the game through a number of different sites: Steam, Epic Games, and of course Giant's own store. The Collector's Edition is available to pre-order through a number of online retailers, and of course PlayStation and Xbox both had it available to pre-order digital copies, as well as a number of bricks and mortar stores where you can pre-order physical copies if that's what you want to get. The Giants store has the added benefit of being able to support your favourite Giants partner simply by adding their partner code when you check out. If you'd like to support the channel Argsy Gaming, simply enter that, all one word, into the checkout at no additional cost to yourself. So first up, we're going to take a look at the changes to the game engine from the presentation of Stefan Geiger, the Chief Technology Officer for Giants Software. He went through a number of different changes, improvements and upgrades that the engine has brought and that we will see through the presentation of the new game. First up, he talked about the lighting, the fog, and of course the God rays. Now they're all kind of packaged in together, they kind of all work in together, so covered off in one little lump. If we talk about the fog to start off with, the fog is going to be in varied densities, basically meaning it will differ across the map. It's not just blanket applied across your screen and across the map. You'll get areas like valleys where you might get thicker and denser fog, across rivers it might accumulate more, or across water bodies, lakes and ponds like that. Areas that in real life you would actually get more fog, and that is how the fog is going to be set up in the new game, which I thought was pretty cool. On top of that, it will change through the day depending on the time of the day, and it will react to the weather. So jumping to conclusions, I'm assuming if it's a warm sunny day, you're unlikely to have much fog during the middle of the day, but on a colder, damper day, there is a higher chance of having fog, as you'd see in real life, which I think is very, very cool. Now we learnt more about the already famous God rays and how those are going to interact with the fog. Of course, the fog is a key part to that. You can't have the God rays without having the fog to be accumulated. We saw the trees and the light shining through the branches and the way that that was creating those rays through the fog. We also saw how local lights and artificial lights would react with the fog. Vehicles, street lights, buildings, etc. all creating those volumetric lighting through the fog, which just looked really, really impressive. Now, this is one thing that I'm kind of looking forward to seeing, but whether it's actually going to add to the gameplay, it's adding to the atmosphere, it's adding to the authenticity of their maps, and that's what I'm looking forward to seeing. Of course, it could get pretty boring if you're driving through fog all the time and not able to see where you're going or anything like that, but I think this is a really good start to hear these changes to the engines and the way that the engine is becoming almost more realistic in its treatment of the lighting, of the fog and of the atmospheric conditions. So very excited to see that. Next up, we heard about further enhancements to lighting, in particular around shadows. We heard about shadows of clouds and how those were dynamically created and actually reacted to the clouds in the sky. No more artificial shadows that didn't relate to clouds, or clouds going in front of the sun and not creating a shadow. If you're standing in a field and look up and see a cloud across the sun and no light coming from it, you'll be standing in a shadow. We saw some very impressive presentations in the video showing how that was going to be working. Soft shadows are a thing. Now this will depend on the distance or the light conditions. So for example, a tall element will be more blurry at the edge of the shadow rather than very close back to the object that's casting the shadow. You can imagine like say a street pole or a street lamp. Near the top of the pole where the sun can diffuse around a little bit more, the shadow at that top point is going to be a lot more diffused than right down at the base where you'll get a much sharper edge. Now this will also be weather dependent, so on a sort of overcast day where you still get some diffused shadow from the light, the shadows will be a lot softer on the ground compared to a bright intense sunlight where you get very sharp shadows, and there was a couple of images which showed that. Another advancement with shadows is on non-shadow casting objects. We're talking about buildings, fences, trees, even in the grass, and you can see that through these images as they scroll back and forth, the changes in the shadows. So it just adds an extra little bit of depth to the shadows on the building and the realism around the landscapes. There'll also be improved shadows for vehicles, merged shadow lights, particularly at night when you're driving around with your lights on. Now it's a bit hard to tell from this, but if you had two vehicles which were shining lights at each other, how the shadows would work on that. It would be very interesting to see whether they would cancel one another out, but awesome to see that the lighting's been reconsidered and the shadows are being done in a much more authentic and realistic way, and extra depth being added to the way the shadows are going to enhance the landscapes around the maps. Stepping out of the shadows and into weather effects, we saw a couple of cool little changes here. Additional mud and dirt will accumulate on tyres and around vehicles as you're driving, and it will be dynamically changing. So if you're driving along a dry, clean road and you had mud on your tyres from say a muddy field, that mud will slowly shed off and disappear. You won't actually have to clean the tyres, it will respond to that, which I thought was pretty cool. There was talk about potentially being some effects around that, some particle effects to actually see the mud and that being shed. So it's quite an interesting change to the way that the mud and dirt is being done, particularly on tyres, which is what we were showing. There's going to be further improvement around rain effects on vehicles. You're going to see water drops appearing on the vehicles, on the windows, on the bodywork. You're going to see tyres will darken when they get wet, so they will change how they appear depending on whether they are dry or when it's raining and they get wet, they'll look a lot darker. Further improved visuals will see water splashes from raindrops. Wetter surfaces like roads will look darker and they will become more reflective as the water reflects light up and off the ground, much like, well, exactly like we would see in real life. So again, starting to think about vehicles driving towards you with lights on. Are you going to see more reflections off the ground? Are you going to be able to see reflections of the trees and the surrounding environment? Who knows, but it does bode well for just improving the immersion that the game will bring to you through these weather effects, through all the different effects that we're going to start seeing the engine bring to us. There's a number of changes discussed around vehicles. Firstly, we saw some interactive water simulation, so driving around in the flooded fields, particularly taking into account the rice paddies that we're going to see with flooded fields, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But as the tractor was driving around, you could see the bow waves there being formed. We did actually see at one stage, I think in the map tour, there was looked like a person walking through the water, and you could see a bow wave being created by that interaction too. So whether that's a thing or not, whether we're reading too much into it, I'm not sure, but it is great to see some of that sort of physics simulation, bow waves from vehicles as they drive through the water. There was some neat little reflections too of the waves as they bounced off the edge. So it's not just a wave being created going forward, it is interacting with the terrain and the surrounding environment to bounce those waves off, which is very, very cool. Other enhancements to vehicles related to bodywork and colouring and things like that. We saw the physically based calibration, so paint colours. That was described to us as kind of the way that Ferrari might try and match their colours is a lot more precise than say an older tractor manufacturer who just held their thumb up and said that's near enough. The coatings on vehicles are also getting a lot more depth. We're going to see more scratches, there's more layers, right through to a clear coat, and that clear coat, we're going to see more reflections. Just as you can see here in the hood of this tractor as it's driving around, you can see the trees and the landscape reflecting in it as it drives forward, and the reflections change. So another great immersion and increase in improvements in graphics that we're seeing there. One of the announcements in the engine presentation that got the biggest cheer from the audience was the announcement of ground deformation. Now, it's not quite the digging, excavating and landscaping that a lot of people had hoped for, but it is a step in the right direction. From what we were shown, you could see that there was displacement mapping across the fields, and this is said to influence the physics simulation. So what does this mean? Well, it's a little hard to tell from what was shared, but my expectation is that as you drive across the rutted fields, your tractor is going to bounce around a lot more than it would if you were driving across a smooth field. Now, the ground deformation is adjusted from tyres and gameplay. What does gameplay mean? I'm not quite sure, but we can see there the ruts that are created by tyres. And from what we've been told, that will adjust depending on the ground conditions. So a wet, damp field in the middle of winter is likely to be softer than a dry, hard field in the middle of summer. So that will be dynamically adjusted depending on weather conditions, depending on the type of ground you are driving over. So excited to find out more about this as we get more announcements leading into the release of Farming Simulator 25, but a step in the right direction, absolutely. Is it as far as we'd hoped? Maybe not quite so, but it is a step in the right direction. Another thing that was announced around changes to terrain was a higher terrain resolution, so that should allow map makers to put a little bit more detail in the terrain, maybe make ditches and things like that a little bit more refined around the edges. Previously, small little holes and things like that were very hard to form in the game, but this will make it hopefully a whole lot easier and a higher resolution to be able to do that with a lot more information going to be available to be presented there in the terrain. Now, a few other features that came through in the presentation on the engine. The sky, there will be an improved sky. We saw a lovely starlit sky with an enhanced moon with a lot more detail in the moon, so looking forward to seeing that in the sky, just adding to the depth of the game. We saw improvements to the trees, the way these are rendered, and a whole lot of information about performance upgrades around rendering of models, rendering of textures and materials. We saw some improvements in models. The engine will provide better geometry compression and internal compression. Now, this in turn will reduce geometry sizes, which in the long run will help reduce slot counts, which will be good news for console players in particular. There was changes to the textures and how these will be handled by the engine. Also an increase in the texture resolution up to 16K textures, which is a huge number and a huge amount of information available to be presented. And that is pretty much a summary of everything that was presented in the engine presentation from Stefan Geiger. Now, we were fortunate enough to have a 10 or 15 minute sit down with him where we asked a few questions. Go and check out DJ Goham's channel. He's shared those interviews in full, and you can find out exactly what we asked of Stefan and some of the answers he gave us there for that. The second presentation was from Florian Boos, the senior level designer for Giant Software. Here we saw our first images of the US-based map Riverbend Springs. As the name suggests, this map is very much orientated around a river, based loosely on the Mississippi River and the rice-growing areas of the southern USA. We were shown a deluge of images first up, all very much with a water theme or river-based location. From small streams and brooks feeding into the river to barges, grain elevators with docks for barges to load and unload, piers, jetties and small boats, houseboats, floating restaurants, and even the ferries for crossing the river. This carried through into other elements, small weirs, water wheels, and the like. There are a number of new elements described: trees, bushes, grass, ground textures, flowers, and of course the new crop spinach. The amount of detail in buildings was expanded on, with new and high resolution textures creating more detailed models which visually provide a wider complexity of the buildings. The amount of detail in buildings was expanded on, with new and high resolution textures creating more detailed models which visually provide a wider complexity to the buildings. There is a wider range of ground textures and fence options for building your own farms, giving more scope for creativity with your farm builds. Those new selling points will be available, including a farmer's market which will have a fully modelled interior, interactive shelves and small selling stands. What this means? Bring something like tomatoes to the sell point, and instead of just disappearing like they would have previously, tomatoes will now appear on the shelves or in the produce baskets. Smaller farm stands or roadside stalls will be available, with passive income being generated when product is delivered. FS22 saw the introduction of production chains, and FS25 will see these expanded further. Smaller productions will be included, the likes of a small carpentry shed or a small cheese factory as examples, making these more accessible and not the large commercial scale we've previously had. This relates well with the diversifying farming industry we are seeing, with the likes of Clarkson's Farms really pushing the diversification of farming further than we have seen in recent times. Want to mill flour on a small scale? Well, in FS25 you will be able to. Florian alluded briefly to what can only be interpreted as the NPCs that we have since learned we will be able to interact with, through the small woodworking shop, making children's playground equipment, horse jumps and other paraphernalia. Now how that all plays out in the game, I am looking forward to seeing that, because I think that is something along the storylines that people have been asking for, so let's just wait and see exactly what we can do. Now the final presentation, and possibly the most exciting, saw Stephen Morris and Manuel Leithner presenting new machines and gameplay. Now first up, we learned a lot more about rice. We already knew it was a thing, but we did learn some more about the processes behind it and some of the differences between short grain and long grain rice. Now rice seedlings can be grown in greenhouses rather than being purchased from the store, although this of course is still an option. Spawning on pallets from the greenhouse, they can then be taken to the field and loaded into the planter. It was explained how floodable rice fields can be created. Utilising the in-game build menu, there will be an option to mark the field boundary with a brush, and the game will generate a floodable field complete with the bunds or dikes around the edges, prepares the soil and places a water pump on the field edge. The water pump has a field management trigger where field information such as size and water level can be inspected, and the field can either be filled or emptied of water. How impressive do those reflections look on the water as we see that water plane filling up? Very nice to see. We also got a look at a new type of rice harvester, the Aizeki 6130, designed specifically for working in fields which have been flooded and might still be too wet and muddy for a standard heavy combine to access. It's a unique style of harvester where the whole plant is cut, taken into the side of the harvester and the plant threshed, separating the rice grain from the plant. And amongst all the rice talk, there was a few comments about the in-game HUD, including the option to scale the HUD. While not a confirmed feature yet, there is also consideration on having the HUD overlays able to be repositioned to different parts of the screen. Now that would be amazing, and something I have had numerous people comment on. Being able to move around where the speedo, where the rev meter, where the different fill icons and things are on your screen, and customizing those to your preference would be awesome. Taking a look at the long grain rice, it has a different harvesting process to the short grain rice used in the flooded fields. Due to the possibility of using larger equipment and therefore possibly generating higher yields, the long grain rice economy will be different to take that into account and kind of level out the field a little bit. Now we saw the CR11 combine harvester using a MacDon header in the rice. A couple of the features of the header were quite interesting, including the integrated header trailer with foldable wheels and drawbar. Now we've seen that before, of course, in the previous games and previous headers, but it also has ground adaptation following the contour of the ground. The header is in 3 sections, allowing each to adjust independently to follow the ground. You can see that working there in that screenshot in that video from in the cab, and it does look very nice. Another new feature which we've already seen is the MacDon swath as part of the pre-order bonus. While we've been able to swath in-game previously thanks to the work of the modders, this is the first time swathing has been included in base game. Now interestingly, the first look we had at this was with the swather in road mode, running backwards with the rotatable seat and the header being towed along behind. Arriving in the field, the seat is rotated 180 degrees and the swather is then in working position, ready to connect to the header. Again, this header has an integrated trailer, so can be folded up and get straight to work. We also saw the new swath crop texture, which differs to the straw windrow, as obviously this still has the grain in it and hasn't been through the combine. Another new feature we saw was the addition of consumables, in particular the use of bale wrap and round bale net required within the baler. We've seen Rani Wrap as a new partner for Farming Simulator 25, and here you can see the use of bale wrap being added as a consumable for the baler. It was confirmed that this is optional. You can just request the baler to be filled through the menu if you don't want to have to refill from pallets. Again, like the swathing, this is something that modders have added to previous games, so it's great to see this becoming a base game feature for FS25, opening it up obviously to console players. The biggest cheer was of course saved for the new GPS and AI worker features. First up was the GPS steering. Taking a Fence 700 fitted with mowers, we saw the tractor driven into the field, with a course around the field similar to what we would see in courseplay. It was explained that the field will be automatically detected, the GPS will recognise the shape of the field regardless of whether it's a mod map or if you've created your own field or even merged multiple fields. It will be done automatically. AI workers will use pretty much the same system, the only difference being that they will do all the work, leaving you free to tackle another task, versus GPS, which will obviously steer the machine in a straight line, while you still need to turn equipment on, off, raise, lower, and accelerate and brake. It's great to see GPS and the improved AI workers coming into Farming Simulator 25. I know this is a huge feature that's been requested for a long time by a big chunk of the community, so it's fantastic to finally see this becoming base game. Now, of course, it's never going to be perfect. Any system is never going to be perfect, but from what I've seen and what they've shown us so far, this looks like it is going to work pretty well. And that wrapped up the gameplay and machine presentations. There was some interesting information shared during the modders presentation, in particular the ability to have unique dashboards or screens within equipment. How this will play out in reality is still to be seen, but great to see features like this being added and expanded on. We had the opportunity to get hands-on with the ignition key coming with the collector's edition, and this thing is impressive. The build quality is fantastic. In fact, the lock barrel is actually the same as a motorbike, so nothing flimsy there. The only comment a lot of people have had is the micro USB rather than USB-C. The main reason for this, as we were told, is cost, with USB-C being a much more expensive option, which would have flowed through to the retail cost of the collector's edition. Otherwise, a quality piece of equipment which will be nice to have sitting on the desk. And that was all the information for Farming Simulator 25 released in August. As I mentioned at the start, we did hear about a new partnership between Giant Software and Straight 4 and their upcoming racing simulator. What the exact details of this partnership will mean, and if it will have any impact on the Farming Simulator franchise, remains to be seen. However, it is great to see Giants expanding their publishing arm further. Watch this space. So, a lot to digest in that one. Keep an eye on future videos as we discuss more about Farming Simulator 25 and bringing you all the latest news as we have it. As always, hope you found this video interesting. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.